Among other things, the Fair Elections Act would end Election Day restrictions against revealing results before all the polls have closed. It would raise the limits for annual donations to political parties and move the oversight responsibility of monitoring election fraud from Elections Canada to a new independent office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Joining us now to tell us what the changes will mean to voters, here's Paul Adams, professor of journalism at Carleton University. And I have to say off the top, an old pal of mine from back in the day when we were both at the CBC. Paul, it's great to see you again. How you doing?
Great. Good to see you.
Let's start with just this general characterization. How would you evaluate the relationship between the Conservative Party of Canada and Elections Canada over the time that the CPC's been in government?
Well, pretty bad. I think you really have to go back before they came into government, because when Stephen Harper was at the National Citizens Coalition, which is what he did before he got back into politics, he actually had a conflict with the Chief Electoral Office over whether third-party groups, or outside groups, non-party groups, I should say, could advertise during election campaigns. And he had a very vituperative relationship with the Electoral Office at that time, and referred to the people working there as jackasses at one point. And essentially, it amounted to a difference over the interpretation of the rules, with the Electoral Office saying that organizations like his couldn't advertise during election campaigns. Mr. Harper actually took the matter to court and lost in the courts. So the courts anyway said the Electoral Office was right, but it set a pattern with Harper and with the Conservative Party after he got back into politics, where the Conservatives tended to push the rules, to interpret the rules very aggressively, to sometimes take the attitude that rules are made to be broken, and then cry foul when the Electoral Office called them on it, essentially saying, well, they're showing favoritism by they're picking on us by enforcing the rules.
And you think that the antipathy that has existed since then stems from that time when Mr. Harper was with the National Citizens Coalition?
Yeah, I think that there's been a consistent pattern since then of antagonism towards the Electoral Office, and I really think it's a shame, because in this country, if you look back over the last 50 or 60 years in Canada, and it's not just at the national level, but also in the provinces as well, we've developed a regime of nonpartisan election administration, which is really admired all over the world. I've covered elections elsewhere as a journalist, and I've led international observation missions for Canada and for international NGOs to elections in the Middle East and Africa. And Canada is really regarded as a model for the rest of the world in terms of its nonpartisan election administration. And the people who run our elections, both federally and provincially, I mean, they're not perfect by any means, but they're a kind of professional priesthood who really believe in the fairness of elections and the nonpartisan administration of elections. And you don't really realize until you get out of Canada how rare that is, but if you stop and think about what's happened just south of the border in the United States, and back to the 2000 election, where, most people went to the polls intending to vote for one candidate, and the other candidate won because of technical, flaws in the process, because of political administration, and then because of politicized courts. And the guy who got fewer votes won as a result of a bungled process. We don't have an experience like that in this country, notwithstanding, people will complain about robocalls, and I'm sure we'll get to that, but that's nothing on the scale of what we've seen in the United States or many other places that we consider to be well-run democracies. Canada really is a model.
Let me read you a quote that the Minister for Democratic Reform, Pierre Poilievre, had to say in unveiling the act. He said the referee should not be wearing a team jersey, in a reference to Elections Canada. What did you infer that he meant from that?
Well, I mean, it seems to be that he and the government and the Conservative Party regard the electoral office as an adversary, and that's not something that's, I mean, it's not appropriate and it's not true. I'm not saying the electoral office never makes mistakes, but it simply is not the case. But I think what he was trying to imply is that right now the system is that the Chief Electoral Office has within his operation also the prosecutorial function. And what this legislation will do is to take that prosecutorial function and remove it from the Chief Electoral Office and put it under the Department of Justice. So I guess what he's saying is that the people who are administering the elections at the Chief Electoral Office won't also be prosecuting cases if there are violations.
In your view, is that a fair thing to do?
Well, I don't think it's going to hurt the fairness of our elections. I mean, I think it's probably an unnecessary thing to do. I think it probably gives you an idea that the Conservatives really do believe what they're saying about the electoral office, that it's partisan or aimed at them in some way. But I don't think that there's any particular reason to be concerned that if it's at if it's removed, that it's going to be a problem in terms of enforcing the laws. I don't think that's a real concern. I think it's disappointing that the government sees the electoral office that way, but I don't think it's a big issue in terms of as voters and citizens. I don't think it's something that need concern us.
The bill's 242 pages long, and we're obviously not going to cover it all here, but we've plucked out a few of the highlights, and I just want to get your views on what you think of the changes that are being proposed. We'll put some of them up here on the screen so we can share the details with our audience first. Tougher penalties, including prison time for impersonating election officers and a mandatory public registry for mass political call campaigns. Bigger distance between Elections Canada and the commissioner in charge of pursuing breaches to the Election Act. Rather than report to the chief election officer, the commissioner will have a fixed term, 7 years, and be under the oversight of the arm's-length Department of Public Prosecutions. A raise in the maximum donation limit for individuals to $1,500 from $1,200. An end to the ban on broadcasting or transmitting election results before all the votes are counted, in recognition of that ban's limits to free speech. And finally, tougher requirements for voters to show identification at the ballot box. Okay, let's go through some of these, and I'll just get your views on them. For example, do you think these changes will help prevent that robocalls business that we saw during the last election?
Well, I think they would help somewhat. I think that the fact that, first of all, that you can't impersonate somebody from Elections Canada without having the possibility of going to jail for it. And secondly, that when there are robocalls made, the scripts have to be kept. It will make investigations after the fact easier. I think that, you know, if you look at the history of electoral abuse, usually what happens is that parties try to fiddle with the rules or break the rules or find a way around the rules, and then the rules are stiffened up, and then parties find new ways to try to get their way. So what this does is it tightens things up around robocalls specifically, and I think that probably it will make it a little less likely that somebody will try to use that technique to distort the outcome of the election. What Mr. Méran, who's the current chief electoral officer, had asked for was something greater, which was that in pursuing cases where there may have been the rules may have been broken, that the authorities be allowed to require the taking of evidence, that people had to cooperate with the investigators, which is not now the case. And so I think what we have here is a set of provisions which will make it harder to do robocalls in an illegal or an improper way, but it won't do much to help investigate whatever new techniques are taken by any party to break or bend the rules.
Okay, let me try another one with you here, and that is this notion of vouching. I've seen this at polling stations all the time where somebody, you know, for whatever reason, forgets their identification or hasn't got it or lost it or something, but their neighbor is there with them, and the neighbor vouches that this person is a citizen and can vote. They want to bring an end to that practice. What's your view on that?
Well, there's been a trend over probably 30, 40, 50 years in Canada to finding ways to make it easier to vote. The danger you always run when you make it easier to vote is that you may also make it easier to cheat or to vote when you're not supposed to. And it's clear that there were problems with this vouching rule. That the minister said that a quarter of the cases of people who were vouched for, there were irregularities, which comes from the Chief Electoral Office itself. Now, irregularities doesn't mean that they shouldn't have voted, simply that the way in which the process was undertaken wasn't strictly according to the book. But still, there's clearly a problem with this provision, and I think it's normal electoral administration that when you loosen a rule, you see how it works, and then you maybe tighten it up again. So I think it might have some effect at the margins. It certainly would deprive a few people of their vote, and it might differentially affect certain kinds of voters, for example, students. And this is something that the NDP has been concerned about. But I don't think it's likely that you're not likely to see many, if any, seats turn on this change in the law.
No, but just to pick up on the first part of that answer there, Elections Canada has in the past had the mandate to try to increase voter participation. And I gather that their mandate to do that is being stripped from them in these new changes. What do you think of that?
Well, a lot of people have pointed out this provision saying, this shows you that the Conservatives really don't care about getting Canadians engaged and getting them out to vote, and they actually like a low turnout election. The Conservatives tend to do a little bit better if turnout is lower because they have sort of harder core, more committed supporters. That having been said, I don't think there's much evidence that Elections Canada's public relations and advertising campaigns have had much effect where they've been in place. That is to say, especially with younger voters, I don't think that they've had much of an effect. Perhaps a little more with Aboriginal voters, but I think, and I've written about this on occasion, with Aboriginal Canadians, it's a different issue. They're so spread out among ridings in Canada, they don't have much of an impact even if they showed up in large numbers. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's disappointing that this is the attitude of the government, but I don't think it's going to make much difference in terms of turnout. And the minister, Mr. Poilievre, said, and I think this is correct, that what really affects turnout is the efforts of parties. It's parties going out and identifying their supporters and getting them out to the polls through their own efforts that really affects turnout. And that's something we've seen in the United States, for example, where turnout has gone up in presidential elections, and it's gone up because the parties have expended enormous effort to get people to the polls. Now, they also have seemingly unlimited access to money down there to undertake that kind of thing. And so, we're not likely to see a repetition of that precisely here. But it is true that at the end of the day, the parties are much more likely to have an effect on raising turnout than the efforts of Elections Canada.
And let me do one more with you, and that is, again, since you brought up the United States, let's do a comparison. In the U.S., I think it's been demonstrated that if there's a landslide for one party or the other in the East, and that gets reported, as it can be, let's say in California, if it's a runaway for the Democrats, the Republican vote tends to be depressed in California because people think, why bother voting, it's already over. I wonder if you think that phenomenon could now come to Canada in future elections. In other words, the vote on the West Coast would be lower if by the time the voters in Quebec and Ontario have rendered a majority government, let's say, on one party or another, people may think, well, we don't really have to vote because we know the outcome already.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess there's a concern about that, and we've already addressed it to some extent by changing the voting hours in the different parts of the country, so there's not such a big lag between when the polls close in Atlantic Canada and when they when they close in BC. But there's no point in having a law that you can't enforce. I, like many people in the last election, went on Twitter, went to American and British websites, and got all the information I wanted about what was happening in Atlantic Canada, even though it was technically illegal. So what's the point in having a law saying that somebody like me, who just wants to know the results of the election, for crying out loud, and people in Britain and the United States have access to it, that somehow this is going to be criminalized? It was a ridiculous, old-fashioned law. It was a hangover from another time. And it was actually something that Mr. Harper, interestingly enough, in his Citizens Coalition days, had encouraged people to break that law. Another example of where he sort of, doesn't like the rules and doesn't feel he has to respect them. But I guess I'm with him on this one, and I think it's about time they changed it.
Okay, let me read something in our remaining moments here then that Chantal Hébert wrote in the Toronto Star just the other day, and then I'll get your comments on that. She wrote, "One does not need to read between the lines of the bill to come to the conclusion that the Harper government is more inclined to see a higher voter turnout as a threat than as an ideal outcome. At a time when most comparable jurisdictions are looking for ways to reverse a decline in turnout, the legislation put forward on Tuesday nudges Canada in the opposite direction. Under this bill, Elections Canada would be allowed to tell voters where and when to exercise their franchise, but forbidden to launch outreach campaigns to encourage them to actually vote. There are all kinds of models that purport to project how a higher turnout among younger Canadians would impact the outcome of federal elections, but they all concur on one finding, and it is that the Conservative Party would lose from such a development." You agree with her conclusion?
Well, I agree that higher turnout would tend to hurt the Conservatives. I think that the Conservatives are strongest among older Canadians, wealthier Canadians who are more inclined to turn out to vote, and that if younger Canadians and some other demographic groups turned out in larger numbers, that wouldn't be good for the Conservatives, and therefore I think the Conservatives, don't have a political interest in much higher turnout, absolutely. But will these measures actually suppress turnout or make it more difficult to increase turnout? I don't think so. As I said, I don't think there's any evidence that the Elections Canada efforts, although they were well-intentioned and worthy, that they were having much of an effect. And I think that really at the end of the day, if the Liberals and the NDP and the Greens think that higher turnout is going to win them elections, they've got to go out, identify those voters and get them to the polls. It's not going to be Elections Canada that's going to do it. It's the parties in whose vital interest it is to get those people, who have to find out ways of connecting with them, talking to them, and getting them to the polls. And sure, maybe at the margins, Elections Canada might have helped a little bit, like you saw Rock the Vote in the United States and various other the public interest campaigns, and we saw this in the last election with these sort of flash mobs and so on. This is all good stuff, but it's not really the fundamental thing that's going to make a difference in turnout.
No, I hear you, but I'm wondering whether you believe that a government's fundamental default position ought to be, philosophically speaking, trying to get more of its citizens out to the polls to participate in democracy.
Well, yeah, sure. I believe that the best thing for Canadian democracy would be full engagement and would be higher turnout.
So shouldn't the government then encourage that in law?
Well, I think that the problem here is not so much about whether Elections Canada is out there advertising and promoting voting. The problem here is the way the government has introduced this legislation without consultation with the Chief Electoral Officer directly, pushing it through Parliament without, full exposure to parliamentary scrutiny and the scrutiny of the media and outside groups. And in this atmosphere of rancor where the minister is calling the Chief Electoral Officer names, what this does is degrade support for our institutions, including the neutral institution of our administration, election administration, which is something we should be proud about in our democracy. And I think that, this is the big problem with the way the government has approached this bill. It's not the specific provisions of the bill. It's the atmosphere, which is not one of this is a core part of our democracy, and we need to engage all the legitimate participants, including the Chief Electoral Officer, including the other parties, including outside groups, and make sure that we all feel like this is a fair regime. That's not what they've done. And in souring the atmosphere around our election administration, I think they add to the disengagement of people and the way they're turned off of politics. But I think that these things, absolutely, the bill does not embody the ideas of a government that really wants to promote voting. On the other hand, I don't think it does that much to frustrate voting. It's not like what you're seeing in the United States, where you see in many states that are controlled by Republicans, active attempts to deny people the vote through changing the ID laws, making it more onerous, particularly for young people, blacks and Hispanics to vote. We're not seeing anything like that here.
Good. Paul, thanks so much for your analysis on this. Good seeing you again.
Good seeing you.
That's Paul Adams, Associate Professor, Carleton University School of Journalism and Communication, on the line from the nation's capital.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.